Hello everyone! Today we read and comment on the second chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. But what we have here said of another direction of views and forces relates only to other positive objects which we may propose to ourselves in war, besides the destruction of the enemy's force, not by any means to the pure defensive, which may be adopted with a view thereby to exhaust the enemy's forces. In the pure defensive the positive object is wanting, and therefore while on the defensive our forces cannot at the same time be directed on other objects. They can only be employed to defeat the intentions of the enemy. We have now to consider the opposite of the destruction of the enemy's armed force, that is to say, the preservation of our own. These two efforts always go together, as they mutually act and react on each other. They are integral parts of one and the same view, and we have only to ascertain what effect is produced when one or the other has the predominance. The endeavor to destroy the enemy's force has positive object and leads to positive results, of which the final aim is the conquest of the enemy. The preservation of our own forces has a negative object, leads therefore to the defeat of the enemy's intentions, that is, to pure resistance, of which the final aim can be nothing more than to prolong the duration of the contest, so that the enemy shall exhaust himself in it. The effort with a positive object calls into existence the act of destruction. The effort with the negative object awaits it. How far this state of expectation should and may be carried we shall enter into more particularly in the theory of attack and defense, at the origin of which we again find ourselves. Here we shall content ourselves with saying that the awaiting must be no absolute endurance, and that in the action bound up with it the destruction of the enemy's armed force engaged in this conflict may be the aim just as well as anything else. It would therefore be a great error in the fundamental idea to suppose that the consequence of the negative course is that we are precluded for choosing the destruction of the enemy's military force as our object and must prefer a bloodless solution. The advantage which the negative effort gives may certainly lead to that, but only at risk of its not being the most advisable method, and that as that question is dependent on totally different conditions, resting not with ourselves, but with our opponents. This other bloodless way cannot therefore be looked upon at all as the natural means of satisfying our great anxiety to spare our forces. On the contrary, the circumstances are not favorable. It would be the means of completely ruining them. Very many generals have fallen into this error and been ruined by it. The only necessary effect resulting from the superiority of the negative effort is the delay of the decision, so that the party acting takes refuge in that way, as it were in the expectation of the decisive moment. The consequence of that is generally the postponement of the action as much as possible in time, and also in space, in so far as space is in connection with it. If the moment has arrived in which this can no longer be done without ruinous disadvantage, then the advantage of the negative must be considered as exhausted, and then comes forward unchanged the effort for the destruction of the enemy's force, which was kept back by a counterpoise, but never discarded. We have seen, therefore, in the foregoing reflections, that there are many ways to the aim, that is, to the attainment of the political object, but that the only means is the combat, and that consequently everything is subject to the supreme law, which is the decision by arms. That where this is really demanded by one, it is a redress which cannot be refused by the other. That, therefore, a belligerent who takes any other way must make sure that his opponent will not take this means of redress of his cause may be lost in that supreme court. Hence, therefore, the destruction of the enemy's armed force amongst all the objects which can be pursued in war appears always as the one which overrules all others. What may be achieved by combinations of another kind in war we shall only learn in the sequel, and naturally only by degrees. We content ourselves here with the acknowledging in general their possibility as something pointing to the difference between the reality and the conception, and to the influence of particular circumstances. But we could not avoid showing at once that the bloody solution of the crisis, the effort for the destruction of the enemy's force, is the first-born son of war. If, when political objects are unimportant, motives weak, the excitement of forces small, a cautious commander tries in all kinds of ways, without great crises and bloody solutions, to twist himself skilfully into a peace through the characteristic weakness of his enemy in the field and in the cabinet, we have no right to find fault with him, if the premises on which he acts are well founded and justified by success. Still, we must require him to remember that he only travels on forbidden tracks where the god of war may surprise him, that he ought always to keep his eye on the enemy, in order that he may not have to defend himself with a dress rapier if the enemy takes up a sharp sword. The consequences of the nature of war, how ends and means act in it, how in the modifications of reality it deviates sometimes more, sometimes less, from its strict original conception, fluctuating backwards and forwards, yet always remaining under that strict conception as under a supreme law. All this we must retain before us, and bear constantly in mind in the consideration of each of the succeeding subjects, if we would rightly comprehend their true relations and proper importance, and not become involved incessantly in the most glaring contradictions with the reality, and at last with our own selves. So this is really the end of the second chapter of the first book, and it's actually one of the most beautiful passages from the whole work, because it kind of recapitulates this chapter on ends and means in war, and fundamentally makes us understand some cornerstones of military action and of waging a war, in fact, in general, in the way we're going to explain now. So basically, if you remember in the previous video, we have talked about how fundamentally taking action actively, that is to be on the, having the initiative fundamentally, and therefore acting on the enemy by attacking him. So in other words, we talked about the attack in a general, in a broader perspective, obviously looking that this can still fluctuates, and we have also observed how politics intervenes, as always, on the military instrument to control and modify it. In this passage, let's call it in this way, Von Clausewitz instead shows us fundamentally what happens when we are on the other side and we have effectively a negative purpose. And Von Clausewitz here defines what's going on in the, let's say, pure defensive, which is naturally ideal, because there is nothing like a pure defense, there is nothing like a pure attack. And in fact, towards the end here, he mitigates, obviously, he has done in other paragraphs to make us understand, just bear in mind that still this fluctuates, but still it's important to get the trends. So, as always, as we have seen in Von Clausewitz, there is theory you have to understand, and practice can vary wildly, but still is deeply chained and rooted in the most intimate way to theory. And in fact, he says here, starting, but what we have here, therefore, henceforth said, of another direction of views and forces relates only to the positive objects. Just always remember, attack is the strong form of is the weaker form of defense with the positive object, while defense is the strongest form of war with the negative object. So relates only to positive objects which we may propose to ourselves in war, besides the destruction of the enemy's force, not by any means to the pure defense, which may be adopted with a view thereby to exhaust the enemy's forces. Now, this distinction is particularly important. Basically, here is saying us that attack, the positive object, has the objective of the destruction of the enemy's force, and the defensive is just the same thing, but in another form. That is to say, to basically to exhaust the enemy's forces, right? So I'm saying it's the same thing because conceptually, actually, in the theory here, it's negative. It's different. Because there is always a moment in which, if you want really to destroy the enemy's force, you have to pass to counter-attack. There is naturally an ideal place in here, like a pure defense, where you exhaust basically the enemy just standing there, and already in the previous videos, Von Clausewitz says that by definition it's impossible even to picture something like that, because even if you are in defense, you still have to have some aggressive capability, or at least action proper. That is to say, you can't just idle in there. But if we were to make to depict an extreme of the story, let's assume we are in pure defense. Still, there is one point in which we have to abandon it if we want to pass to counter-attack. And really, in a war, in a real war, there is nothing like the enemy really melting himself away against an obstacle in attack. Just with one guy just stays idling, because otherwise, if just banally, if one was literally idling, could be just slaughtered on his feet and doing nothing. So it's obvious that there is always this counter strike capability inherent in the defense. So at the end of the day, the destruction of the enemy's force, as Von Clausewitz, as if you have heard, is always remembers obviously to be at the base of every military action. It's impossible to conceive everything otherwise, and this passage is basically what this is about, really, this topic. So here he plays a little bit with the concept, and he's basically introducing now, going a bit deeper into the relation, in fact, between attack and defense, purely meant. Here it doesn't concentrate much on the terms in themselves, but still on the concept of positive / negative object or purpose. That is basically the same thing. So here he goes on and says, in the pure defensive, the positive object is wanting, and therefore, while in the defensive, our forces cannot at the same time be directed on other objects. Here, I don't know whether it's probably waiting, actually not all, but here, so here they can only be employed to defeat the intentions of the enemy. So in other words, what you have to do in the defense is staying there and waiting, basically, and hoping that your condition of force, that hopefully is real at this point for having taken that choice, will fundamentally defeat the intentions of the enemy. That is to say, it's a form of deterrence, if you want, in the sense that, if you own a very strong position, the enemy may not be even not necessarily capable, but here, in fact, it may not have the certainty or the intentions, the courage to defeat you, right? So to go there, actually, and take action. So that's what the defense basically is, and it's a form of delayment, if you want, of delay, sorry. So it's something now that we will look a bit more in detail. In other words, you don't seek for the active destruction of the enemy, simply discourage the enemy to attack you, right? And this discouragement naturally also stems from the fact that you have, in case of of combat starting, an edge given by your defensive position, that or condition, if you prefer, that obviously is meant to strike back in part from an advantaged position, right? So here, and when I say position, doesn't mean literally a physical position. I mean, even if you were on a flat ground, literally, so with no other factor assuming it, which is obviously absurd, but it's always like that. It's still the attacker was gonna make more effort than what you're doing in defense. So that's why the defense is the stronger form of war in this sense, but with a negative object. That is to say that you stay there and you basically leave the initiative to the enemy in the process, because basically the initiative of the enemy is tied to the intentions of the enemy that can be influenced by the cost that you're presenting by staying there and defending. That's how it is. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, we have now to consider the opposite of the destruction of the enemy's armed force, that is to say, the preservation of our own. So this is it's better if I go on, because here it explains it directly. These two forces always go together. That's the point. As they mutually act and react on each other. They're integral parts of one and the same view, and we have only to ascertain what effect is produced when one or the other has the predominance. So, in other words, here there is no military action whatsoever to which you basically don't have the objective to destroy the enemy's armed force and preserving your own, because it's reciprocal. The enemy is gonna go the same exact way. He wants to destroy your armed force, and he wants to preserve his own. So this is, as von Clausewitz notices here, obviously they always go together, obviously, but never banally in this sense, as they mutually act and react on each other. So they're reciprocal. This goes back to the laws of reciprocity of the first chapter. They are integral parts of one and the same view. That is to say that you conceive them basically simultaneously. And you have only to ascertain what effect is produced when one or the other has the predominance. And here only is kind of a it's kind of funny, because basically that's always right. It happens all the time. So there is not a moment in which the one of the two basically doesn't is perfectly equilibrated. This is to say that there is always a moment in which the balance of forces is altered. There is nothing like a purely equal force that, I mean, even if it was measurable physically through physical force, it could never be the same, right? There is always an imbalance for which tendentially what you are doing while you're defending is in fact trying to preserve your own forces, and what you're doing when you're attacking is to destroy the enemy's armed force, which doesn't mean that actually you're doing both things at the same time. But in the case of the defender, the preservation of your forces is more important in the overall balance, and it has an upper hand on the objective destruction of the enemy's armed force, and vice versa, right? And we're talking about the combat proper, because you could still have other reasons for putting yourself into the condition of defending, right? You may have infinite reasons for doing it. It's not necessarily something that stems from an actual calibrated mathematical calculation, but it could also strategically derive from other even if you got it right as a tactical decision, it still could be strategically something that you don't have to accept. I mean, in certain cases your objective might not be actually preserving your own forces. I mean, it always, let's be honest in here, it is always his, but still, it always is, but it could still be declined to the other needs that maybe your order, like if you have to protect a position at all costs, say it's obvious that here the object is always the destruction of the enemy's armored force and the preservation of our own. But still, let's say that in that desperate situation, probably the preservation of your own forces is more important than the destruction of the enemy's armored force, until something doesn't happen. Because if you were just concerned about preserving your own forces, you would get the hell out of there, right? So that's how the thing is banded eventually, but that depends on something that goes beyond the reciprocity here of combat that is still intended in a theoretical dimension. So this is important to stress. These two objects exist at all times, and they're simply the two faces of the same metal, right? And they always act and react on each other. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, the endeavor to destroy the enemy's force has a positive object and leads to positive results, of which the final aim is the conquest of the enemy. Linear and clear. So here he just presented the what happens in the attack. Then he says, the preservation of our own forces has a negative object, leads therefore to the defeat of the enemy's intentions, that is, to pure resistance, of which the final aim can be nothing more than to prolong the duration of the contest, so that the enemy shall exhaust himself in it. So in the pure defensive, the positive object in this sense is really waiting, right? So it's basically delaying, is to prolong the duration of the contest, into which you hope that the enemy shall exhaust himself in it. And this is this delay, let's say, as you understand, it's no let's say by itself. Okay, we will see it later how this eventually comes to an end. How obviously there is an interest to be in defense in an attack according to the changing balance, right? So these things do not really happen because they it's really an option. I mean, it's obviously always an option in the sense there is you're in command and you can decide what to do, but there is the good decision and the bad decision, and you should hopefully be able to, at the end of the day, to basically look at this balance, right? And the duration of the context, so you realize that's the negative object, because what you're doing finally as an you're having finally as an aim here, and von Clausewitz is very explicit about this, is okay that you have in mind to defeat the enemy's intention, but fundamentally you're still leaving the initiative. This is to say, you're just prolonging the duration of the contest. There is nothing like an active, there's nothing like a positive object really meant. You're not going there to do something. You're simply staying there. And obviously, this doesn't, once again, this is still theoretical. That is, it's obvious that half of the times, by approximation, defense is the best option. It's always reciprocal, because from the other side, it's the other way. If for you it's convenient to defend, for the enemy it's convenient to attack, and vice versa, right? So there is nothing, morally negative in doing something like delaying the action. That has to do, let's say, I said morally, but in the sense of what should be done. It's obvious that if a commander makes a wrong assessment to attack or to defend when the balance is unfavorable, and let's assume he doesn't know, because that can happen, he can make a disaster, and that's what now von Clausewitz also will talk about. It is, and bear in mind that here von Clausewitz is not repeating it, but actually we have seen how the human mind in general tends preferably to delay the action. That is to say that basically the humans are instinctively prone to defend more than attacking, and even suspending the action, actually. In this sense, there is nothing that prolonging the duration of the contest. And in a purely abstract way, however, but tendentially, attack should be instead preferred. If you have, obviously, in fact, the reason for doing it. That is to say that because in the Clausewitzian theory, wars should be as quick as possible. That is to say, if you really have to fight this, that is something pretty dramatic in which people die, etc., the best thing is to settle it as soon as possible, theoretically. That is to say, to concentrate larger effort, if you can. And von Clausewitz has this sort of BS, but here he's presenting it to us not because he's really biased about it. Obviously, there is no tendency in the Clausewitzian theory that should tell you, that you should preferably always attack if you can. But it's still a direction that you should follow in order to speed up things, because at the end of the day, the more you delay the contest, the more resources are gonna be consumed from both sides. That is, human lives, fundamentally, and lots of other things that also have a very high cost. So that's where the negative object really comes from. That's where the negativity stems from. And it's obvious that in real war, then it's enormously complicated already to figure out what's the best option, where to defend and to attack. But just to know that still the instinct of humans is preferably to stay in defense, to stay in the shelter, in the nest, and see what happens outside and there. If there is something particularly favorable to exploit, they go for it, but only where everything is certain. Otherwise, you just stay there, and that's something you can't understand. It's deeply rooted in any natural contest. I mean, it's against the instinct of survival to throw yourself out there most of the times in the fight, and instinctively you're pushed back. Instead, that's where reason should, let's say, the BS is more from this instinctive side here, and von Clausewitz is just trying to rebalance that. That is to say, you don't have to shift always the balance towards the attack, but still, considering human nature, basically humans tend to defend more than they should, on average, tendentially, right? And instead, you should, by getting, and part of the reason, naturally, we will see why, this is almost entirely justifiable, because it's obvious that most of the times you neither know what the hell is going on around you, and therefore it's way more prudent to stay where you are, and to, in fact, we have observed that even the suspension of the military operations that happens, the suspension of action actually during the military operation is something that takes the majority of the time. That is, most of the times armies are not fighting. They are simply staying there and seeing what happens and resting and reorganizing. And that is naturally prudent, because it turns out that for our limited cognitive functions and physical limits, etc., that's better. But at the same time, this still has a cost that is always entailed, and therefore it's as if all the wars that were fought could have been settled tendentially in a much quicker way, that maybe in the moment of the fight would have been bloodier, like a great bloodshed, but that would have ended and resolved itself pretty quickly, so that it would have not had these consequences that instead are these draggings that are even in any kind of conflict of simply armies. Think about foraging, I mean, going around the country, looting and sacking and burning and destroying. So that obviously sounds kind of strategic, right? You know, the idea that, yeah, okay, let's take what we can, let's basically delay the action doing something that strengthens us in the meanwhile. But the best generals are those essentially who are able to figure out that it's as if there was a gap that between the fighting forces that really tendentially doesn't want to be closed, right? Because that means combat. That is the end of the story. Either you win or lose. Instead, this expectation that things maybe one day will solve themselves by themselves. In fact, you know, makes you believe that's how you can on the base of which you can act, and instead it's nothing but causing, at the end of the day, more damage and rendering a worse service, even humanitarily speaking, to the world matter. That's also why pacifism, in many ways, is kind of ridiculous, because it doesn't take into consideration that acting. Obviously, this has nothing to, because pacifism tells that you shouldn't even start the military, operation. Shouldn't start the action in itself, but you know that you can basically delay everything. That there is that tendentially there is no need to fight after all, because problems will settle by themselves. It's sort of cowardly and stupid consideration, because things do not solve them by themselves. They always need to be solved, and in a better and more effective way than it is usually done. And that's what you resort to the military action for. It's not lust for blood or destruction because you're an assassin, simply because sometimes military action is really the best choice. And the myth that it's always better to, the peaceful settlement. Really? I mean, do you really think so? I mean, do you think that even in case of dictatorships or totalitarianisms against criminals and all, that's the reason why we have weapons. That's the reason why we have armed forces. That's the reason why humans resort to war pretty, fairly often. At the same time, it's something that, if you look at on the broader picture, it's still relatively rare. It's not that we are literally at war all the time. And after all, the same war is settled on this idea that you should take action, not truly with delay, but that action should be suspended, because there is still something else that can intervene that is outside the same exercise of violence, and that has to do in fact with politics. That is in fact reinforcing the Clausewitzian paradigm, and now it's complicated. Maybe the way I explain it now, it's a bit foggy and blurred explanation, but it's still quite important to understand the tendency to say, okay, well, we can't do without the worst solution, right? It's like, well, you don't want to take the bitter medicine and you still feel sick. It's sort of stupid to delay. You should go there, and you should, but it costs, but it's still, you may be, you're actually repulsed by that, because you expect the moment you will take the medicine, that will kind of hurt or be disgusting or something like that, but still you will be overall much better afterwards on the long run. So it's a sort of emotionalistic approach, if you want, into this that ruins the story, and that's why wars, after all, should be so efficient. So what is that in fact we praise when we look at military history, and we look efficiency, we look cold blood, we look we appreciate intelligence and clarity and awareness and decision, because we know that those are what it takes to settle the matter as quickly as possible. Otherwise, all the draggings can be really worse than that, right? So that's what also gives a bit the idea of it. Then here von Clausewitz explains it further and says, the effort with a positive object calls into existence the act of destruction. the effort with negative object awaits it. Now this is, one of those phrases in which von Clausewitz is able to condensate everything in a few words and to recapitulate. It's very fascinating in his prose how he alternates these two things, because it never, because if you were just to read this phrase, you would say, well, you would still just only probably mumbling and wondering what the hell does that mean. So that's why von Clausewitz wrote an entire work, but it really gets down to these essentials, really. So the effort with a positive object calls into existence the act of destruction. That is, you're gonna go there and blow the hell out of that guy if you can. The effort with the negative object awaits it. That is, if you defend, you're basically just looking at your clock and saying how much time has passed and what's the enemy waiting for, because you're just also awaiting the enemy reaction, because that's what the whole unit of combat is calibrated upon, right? It's always there is no other way to put it. The problem now is complicated by the the political action. Now we will naturally see it, because obviously this is always talking about war in its detached dimension, but it's never like that. We have seen it. Politics is always there. There is not even a single moment in any kind of war in which politics doesn't constantly affect the use of the military instrument. And that really doesn't go in terms of mandate, that is to say, what the general is told, because the general is not an automa. He's an automaton. The soldiers are not automaton. They also have their beliefs. That's politics in society actually always existing onto the field in the armed forces, right? But von Clausewitz goes on and says how far this state of expectation should and may be carried we shall enter into more particularly in the theory of attack and defense, in the origin of which we again find ourselves. So, these topics are, effectively deepened elsewhere. Here, going on, we shall content ourselves with saying that the awaiting must be no absolute endurance, and that in the action bound up with it the destruction of the enemy's armed force engaged in this conflict may be the aim just as well as anything else. So here, this is another very important concept that we stressed at the beginning. The fact that you're waiting for the enemy to act, you're leaving the initiative, and therefore you have this negative purpose because you're in defense, doesn't absolutely not be this continuous, unstoppable endurance of right. It should always be aimed at the end of the day at the destruction of the enemy's force engaged in the conflict, right? So when we differentiate this positive and negative object, this is still something that can change constantly. You may have the negative object in one moment, the positive in another, and in any military action, this always changes constantly. I mean, obviously with a certain degree of certain phases, but you can pretty clearly understand. I mean, think about the American Civil War. How many times it went back and forth. One was attacking, one was defending. And sometimes the same battlefields. And that is how it works. And it really corresponds to all of this switching, right? Now the problem is that the armed forces do not really behave on, perfectly and automatically on the base of this. Fluctuations, right, on this swinging. There is always a cognitive problem. There is always the idea that you may not clearly realize in which situation you really are, whether it's better to attack or to defend in that particular moment. But still, this is kind of evident. I mean, to who makes was a professional who has led troops, who has to assess that constantly. Well, even I would say the average person has kind of a even instinctive feeling about it, because even instinctively speaking, if we were completely devoid of reason, well, you look at animals, animals perfectly understand these dynamics. They can perfectly understand where they can attack, because the enemy, the prey, let's assume, is is weak, maybe is being left out of the group, so it's not dangerous, etc. So there is always this even innate, instinctive, and natural understanding of such dynamics. Still, however, what happens in war is way more complicated to assess. Human societies, as well as wars, are not something natural. They're artificial. They are something that is a product of civilization, something that went far beyond what we are built biologically, evolutionarily, right? So it's still something way less intuitive, and that's why it requires, especially at those levels in which the action has to be taken, reason rather than instinct. You can't just operate with reason in this sense. You also need some guts, you need some courage and other qualities that you need commitment. So that's not the only thing you have. You can't be just a completely intelligent but, let's say, cowardly person, for example. You can't command in that case. It has to be very, very differently calibrated. What in this phrase von Clausewitz was saying anyway is that at the end of the day, whether this purpose or object, as you may want to call it, can swing between positive and negative, still, and that therefore there is respectively a great difference, because it's respectively about destroying the enemy's force, armed forces, or awaiting for the enemy basically to give up, to defeat his own intentions. Still, the whole action still revolves for both sides constantly about the destruction of the enemy's armed force, right? So the two things are, these two aspects are on two different levels. How attack and defense interact on each other to make it simpler, and how the balance, the advantage shifts, has no effect on what the main object of the whole story is. It is that two enemies being in war, in this political act of violence that they decided to settle by arms, as we will see now in a while, is still aimed at the destruction of the enemy's armored force. Right. This is still theoretically because it's assuming that nothing else intervenes on it, right? Where politics may, because otherwise things would be relatively simple. If it was really just a clash, a fight, we would live in a kind of a much more, basically, I don't think we would exist as a species at that point, but and it would still be about everything settled by fight, right? So in this abstract, there is nothing like that. There is way more intervening, and von Clausewitz, in fact, talks about this at the end of the passage, if you remember, but we're gonna cover it now in a while. And here von Clausewitz gets to a very important conclusion, or at least statement. It would therefore be a great error in the fundamental idea to suppose that the consequence of the negative course is that we are precluded from choosing the destruction of the enemy's military force as our object and must prefer a bloodless solution. If you remember, at the beginning of the work, there was this, at the very beginning, actually, von Clausewitz says, that there are certain humanitarian spirits, that's how he calls them, that think that basically wars should be about, spilling less blood as possible. Von Clausewitz says that is insanity, And it really is. And this phrase here is particularly connected to that story, because here he doesn't explicitate, not in that case, frankly, but the concept is very clear. That is to say, there is here it's actually, this phrase is bended to showing us that you still don't choose whether the destruction of the enemy's armored forces is our object or not in action, in combat, right? Because that's really what it is, right? But here is still referring to it because he's saying, there is no way you can prefer a bloodless solution. If you are doing that, it's because your political goals have told you, maybe let's withdraw from this because it's not convenient anymore. But that's wholly another matter. When you talk about war and combat, you cannot think about it without killing people. It's impossible. It's opposed to any logic and reason. If you resorted to that, that's what you have to do. And then obviously, as we've been saying now, there are many factors that mitigate that, not just from politics, but from within the same waging of war, because there are limits in our physical world that impose you that. However, war is always about this, and it would be preferable from a strictly humanitarian point of view for these wars to be all about getting to that settlement immediately. Because if you choose the option that is with violence, because if you choose the option of dragging this, like saying, okay, well, maybe I don't want to spill too much blood, because that first of all does not exist in reality. I believe that's how far and rightfully Clausewitzian concept goes, because that may happen, as we said, if you have a political reason for it. But once the political reason has opted for war, given that he can withdraw at every second, the object is that, you have to achieve it in combat through bloodshed, and there is no other way around that. And any other waging of war in a different way is just a loss of human life proper. That is to say, the deadliest you are, basically, and the least you have to kill. That is particularly important. Just to make a banal, not so banal example, nuclear weapons. Ever since nuclear weapons are around, human conflict has literally frozen. Why do you think that has happened? Because we grew more civilized, more intelligent? No, it's because we're freaking terrorized at the idea that we can wipe each other out, because now we know we have the means for doing that. That's the only thing that is preventing us from doing it. So it's not improvement of civilization, and this is something that's what history showed us, that the improvement of civilization has absolutely not decreased human destructive capabilities or conflictual nature. There's nothing like that. And whoever thinks about this is frankly grossly ignorant, I believe. I don't think that any sensible person can actually believe that, oh well, okay, there are culturalists around, there are pacifists around. It turns out for them, they don't understand it because they're too stupid, obviously, but they don't understand that what they're doing is actually harming, humanitarily speaking. Because pretending that, first of all, that we're not what we are is not gonna bring a very good result. Because, scientific evidence is something that you can even disbelieve, but if you go against it, you don't have many choices, man. But the problem is that they fuel, actually, solutions that are half solutions, so that do not accomplish a good thing. They basically delay. They have this fundamentally negative attitude, right? With the problem in this sense that they're actually inflating the bubble. They're fueling it, by the way, still with valid reasons for which eventually people get to kill each other. It's not surprised that our, politically speaking, in our days, what some of the most violent fringes you found out there are, from political sides that were tendentially against military commitment, for example. And that is a brilliant proof that there is no cultural way to settle human conflict. Human conflict is written in our genes. It's what we are about. And if you're denying that, you're basically just growing schizophrenic, claiming certain things from one side, but getting angry from the other, and eventually having to relieve that with violence and rage and aggression. And you're experiencing it in politically speaking very clearly nowadays. Naturally, there are other reasons that are in fact political and social and whatever. But that's the same the old story. War, the military instrument, is not evil. Evil is in human mind, is in the political action. A political policy has the option to do one good thing and one bad thing. The military instrument is just an instrument. It's like the gun. There's a freaking huge difference between shooting an innocent civilian as doing nothing, is passing there, and shooting, an enemy that is attacking you, and maybe is a criminal, etc. What's really the point? And the Clausewitzian principle are continuously reconfirmed by any kind of action that happens anywhere, because Von Clausewitz has left us this masterpiece of civilization and human understanding and intelligence and light and reason that goes beyond this emotionalistic garbage that we're constantly dragged back. And part of the reason is because we have exactly lost the awareness that politics and violence are strictly connected, and it takes to understand them both if you really want to make a good use of them. That is to say, pretending the military instrument does not exist, or that violence does not exist, or that we're not violent, is just a way to misuse that in any ways, with devastating effects that hit people, that kill people, for real. But this is a digression, but here Von Clausewitz is telling fundamentally this. So he goes on and says, the advantage which the negative effort gives may certainly lead to that is the bloodless solution, but only at the risk of its not being the most advisable method, as that question is dependent on totally different conditions, resting not with ourselves, but with our opponents. That is to say, leaving the initiative to the enemy is risky. But more, it's not something you can do if without excuse me, without a limit, because my headphones are damaged in them. So this is, in my opinion, very the crucial point of the story, that there are basically factors that can bring you to obviously lay in the defensive, but they're still based on certain conditions that you can't sometimes evade, right? Or better, that you're not brought to, because they're not advantageous, right? But this doesn't mean that, as a rule, defense is something you should use all the time, preferably, because that's the way, that's pretty senseless. That's why, for example, I believe what in artificial intelligence, what we lack most of the times today, look at video games. Most of video games, even take FPS or something like that. The concept in there is that you can kill lots of enemies simply because the enemies are dumb, because they always advance, right? And you stay there, you can't gun them down. Well, reality is very different. It's way more complicated, it's way more unpredictable, and if you want to solve the problem, you have to take solutions that unavoidably entail the fact that you have to go out there and risk, right? That's why it's so complicated, and that's why we are so far from everything that even barely resembles a real behavior on a battlefield. Even in artificial intelligence, and I personally believe that we'll never reach that. There will never be such a complex machine that will be able to calculate every single factor at the point of saying, yes, look, the thing will happen in this way. Because simply that goes as far as reproducing a human mind. And not only, but also reproducing, and that is already impossible, in a real human mind. I mean, not an approximated one, like those artificial intelligence developers want to make you look as, but that's not even remotely like a human mind. Doesn't matter if you can get a robot to drive a car. That doesn't mean anything. That's still something built, by the way, by a human mind, simplified in a way that basically make it functions in certain situations, but it's enormously different. Plus, you have to imagine not just to reproduce one mind, but to reproduce millions of minds interacting together. So can you believe that that can be ever accomplished at the point that you can decide whether to fight or not? And even if that was created, do you think that that would make a difference on the way humans actually fight? Because that's the real point, that there will be always someone will say, well, I don't care, I think it's false, let's doubt of this, because just like we do it nowadays with the very sophisticated systems that we and experimental systems that we have fundamentally to wage war, and that's why probably the best way to and that's why we do this in Schwerpunkt. The best way to get closer to that is simply studying military history. That's really all it takes, because military history, and we will see it, well, theoretically should be studying military history and leading armies, but I suspect that at least the majority of my followers are not leading armies at the moment, nor I am, but therefore military military history is, in a way, some of the most convenient ways to get that sensibility, that criticism, to understand when it's the case to attack, when it's the case of defend. And in the military mind, that obviously we will get into now, because we have ended the third the second chapter. We're getting into the third, that is about the military, the genius of war, right? And that's what here von Clausewitz, in fact, is about to answer to. We'll observe how can the mind fare into this extremely turmoilous, I don't even know if there is such a word in English, realm, domain of war, really, because that's the real problem. Everybody wanting to find the real how to fight, having those elementary essential rules that if you get those, you can you're smart, you can do it. It's garbage. It doesn't exist. You need to actually have a military experience and to study military history at the same time, and that's the best you can get. And still, whoever does this perfectly knows that there is no absolute solution. That's the beauty, and that's where you need something else. And you need also to have a much broader knowledge and understanding of policy and society, because otherwise, even the military experience is basically useless. That's what Clausewitz in theory effectively teaches, right? So I don't remember when we were in here. Well, here, relatively to the last phrase that we're commenting, here, he stresses naturally the fact that at that point, when you have a negative purpose, you're just waiting for the enemy to act. What you're doing is that you're leaving the initiative to the enemy. That is to say, you're basically renouncing to a to settle certain conditions, and leaving the choice to the enemy, right? Even, and it's obvious that certain conditions are obviously more important than others, so that's why you hopefully went on the defensive, because you think that certain condition is vital for, or at least particularly is fundamental, let's put it this way, for you to come out of that combat alive. But still, you're kind of leaving to the enemy, on average at least, more conditions to play on. That can be very dangerous, because the combinations can be really many, or maybe, okay, not excessively many, but still kind of broader, to take action with certain ease, that if you were pressing him on in attack, maybe you wouldn't have, but at the same time, in that case, the enemy would have the advantage of the defense. So it's always reciprocal. Action and reaction, it's always the same old story, right? Clausewitz goes on and says, this other bloodless way cannot, therefore, be looked upon at all as the natural means of satisfying our great anxiety to spare our forces. On the contrary, when circumstances are not favorable, it would be the means of completely ruining them. So this is a step further. It's basically telling us that if you were to remain constantly in defense, well, at a certain point you would have to be obliged to reverse that if you really want to survive, right? Because this works as long as defense gives you an advantage. That's as simple. When it becomes disadvantageous, you have to change that and getting on the move. Naturally, that has a cost. So no wonder that sometimes you're cornered, right? And sometimes you can't even choose much, because still it's as if you were on the head of the elephant, right? So there are things that go out of your control, even if you are one of the best commanders around. And Clausewitz adds, very many generals have fallen into this error and been ruined by it. And that's the instinctive tendency to feel secure in a defensive position, right? Saying, oh, well, if I entrench in here, it's the good position, I don't have to abandon it. And that's the point, that there are moments in which you should take action. You should have, in this sense, a lot of ability, a lot of courage, a lot of valor to choose to go, sometimes even what seems to be the instinct of survival, to do something that on the long run can save your life. And that's civilization in a nutshell. That's why war also has this incredible function of civilization booster, historically speaking, that that there are civilizations that after certain wars flourish intellectually, economically, etc., because they have understood what the deal is in terms of daring, right? Think about Rome. Before the Second Punic War, there was part of the Senate that said, oh, no, we shouldn't get out of Italy because by tradition, because obviously there were interests, because that part of the Senate was involved chiefly in agricultural business, and they didn't want to leave Italy. They feared the expansion of maritime trade and all, the rise of new classes that they could compete with the senatorial luxus. That's why policy and society are inescapably tied to war, and there is no other way around. Every person will want to conceive war without policy and society is just an idiot, and there is no other way to, and that's who loses regularly in wars. So that was an example, but I was talking about how civilization, and Rome Scipio broke that, and Rome rockets to the stars because crushes the Carthaginians, expands into Mediterranean chain, and becomes fundamentally the real empire at that point. Even though some provinces outside Italy had already been created, but still it was something. It was an obstacle. It's an obstacle to surpass, and here Von Clausewitz is perfectly aware of that. here it says very many generals saying, not just nitwits, but even, kind of strong people. I mean, there are many examples of this, historically speaking, of defensive positions that have been held for, actually with this idea that that was as much as actually as attacks will fall, but let's say that distinctively the attack is something that puts you into alarm more concretely, right? An attacker is always tendentially it's on average tendentially more more attentive to the evolution of the situation. That's why also the attack is the weaker form of war, because it has always this very fast potential of involving, right? And that's why even the clash between two attacking armies is by norm much less bloody, contrarily to what instinctively you'd think of an attack against a defense, right? As a proof that we're not automatons, and that humans in wars function in a certain way, especially when they are in larger groups that function tendentially, as larger systems, mathematically speaking. They try to stand to the average, to stay to the average line more than individuals do. But they're still groups of individuals, so that's what makes it even more interesting. Clausewitz goes on and says, the only necessary effect resulting from the superiority of the negative effort is the delay of the decision, so that the party acting takes refuge in that way, as it were, in the expectation of the decisive moment, right? So in here, if I understand correctly, it's already showed the idea that there is a that the only necessity for having this negative effort is acquiring, let's say, the conditions for which you can act once again by taking once again the initiative, right? So it's not really something that you do because you really think that the enemy can crush on you, like and annihilating itself, just like a wave on a cliff, right? There is always a moment in which you are going to seize the opportunity to pass on the counter-attack fundamentally, and therefore passing once again to the attack, and the enemy necessarily on the defense, right? And it's not escapable. I mean, there are not halfways between attack and defense. Even let's leave aside the commander's decisions and how they are effectively executed, but people in masses that we're mentioning just a few moments ago sense that there's always a side that is pushing and another that is falling back, and it's always like that, and there is not a middle ground in that, in which nobody attacks or defends. There is always this side that is kind of pushing more, and the other is pushing back fundamentally. That is falling back. So, and this is also crucial, this space and the time, right? And here Von Clausewitz says it. In fact, now we explain it. The consequence of that is generally the postponement of the action as much as possible in time and also in space, insofar as space is in connection with time. And this is particularly important. The defensive is conceived in this fashion. That is to say, you can't run away for too long, right? So either you meet, obviously from the other side, as we said, if you run away in one place that is particularly favorable to you, and the enemy arrives there and says that he cannot attack you, well, at that point, the situation can even go like, the fight stops because there is no way out to solve that. But at that point, there is still the postponement. I mean, the idea that in the meanwhile, certain forces are still deteriorating. So the enemy, the time it takes to figure out what's the best option is still decreasing strengths. That's why, it would be theoretically better if anybody already knew what to do, because in theory, in pure abstract, doesn't unfortunately happen into reality, or maybe fortunately doesn't, is that, if everybody knew that, nobody would fight. That's mathematically, if you get to the infinite limit, that's the point. If everybody knew, everything would be unnecessary, right? And a little step back, everything would be extremely quickly accomplished and re-equilibrated, right, by the military action. So definitely settled more than re-equilibrated. So here, however, von Clausewitz poses another point, that is, if you delay in time, you're not just delaying abstractly, like, let's just stop wherever you are and watch at your clock and see how much time passes. You also have to consider space as a variable, because that's what fundamentally you're anchored to, or anchored, I don't know how to say it in English. Normally, defensive positions are elevated. That's pretty banal, right? Or however, they are in certain spaces that are particularly difficult to assault because they present some more energies to spend in order to be seized, right? So even this idea of falling back, that is a concept of defense, has to be dimensioned in a space, and that's the reason why there is always an army that pushes, another that falls back. Then it happens at one point you can't, one of the two has to give up in a certain way. So either you stop, and either stopping in this sense makes you understand what really losing the initiative really means, rendering the initiative to the enemy, because in a way it's always negative, not just in terms of purpose, but also in terms of energies being spent, right? So you are putting yourself into a condition in which the enemy can theoretically also wear you out. The defense, thinking about a siege, right? If the enemy besieges you, well, chances are that you was being worn out. Yeah, you're in the strong defensive position, but it's not good for you. And some of the greatest battles, at least in history, have been revolving around this same kind of situation. Not only this is a relative example, but it also tells you how the thing can be, broadly and strategically kind of disadvantageous sometimes, and ruinous most of the time, because if you bottle yourself up in one place, well, then that can even mean annihilation in many ways. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, if the moment has arrived in which this can no longer be done without ruinous disadvantage, which is what we were just thinking of now, then the advantage of the negative must be considered as exhausted, and then comes forward unchanged the effort for the destruction of the enemy's force, which was kept back by a counterpoise but never discarded. So this is the real point. You can't run forever. You can delay the fight, but it comes a moment in which you need to pass on the counterattack. And it always happens, even if we are not really in disadvantage, because what you want to do is to exploit an advantage. let's assume you have run away into a favorable position, and then what you do, you have to meet the enemy at one point. The enemy may at that point say, okay, well, I can't take that position, so let's assume let's maybe encircle this guy, let's besiege this guy. Well, at that point you see sorties, for example, to try to break it out. So at that point, what happens when you see the counterattack is that at that point, here brilliantly put by von Clausewitz, the advantage of the negative must be considered exhausted, right? And this option of counterattack is necessary now, because it had never been discarded. Never. That's intrinsic. That's just like the option of striking. You know, you don't really choose it or not. It's like human. The option of violence for politics. It's not something that you can think it doesn't exist. It's always there by default, right? And at that point, maybe if you're in advance, you say, well, okay, maybe there are many wars, for example, where falling back, therefore defending, has brought to the enemy being that is pursuing you being worn out, especially if it is usually in your own territory where you can be easily supplied while the enemy can't, and it's being worn out, and then you counterattack when he's too weak. So the ultimate objective is still passing to the counterattack. It's always having this positive ultimate goal of destroying the enemy's force that in fact entails in itself the positive object. So in other words, destroying the enemy's force is always tending towards that abstract of war and how it should be. That is, that you have actively to strike actively. You have to lead actively this struggle, right? Because that's how you can put an end to the fight itself. And even imagining that the enemy still annihilates himself, against you, still that's never complete, right? You always have something to lose by not passing to the counterattack, let's say when the enemy is routing. Your objective at that point is pressing the enemy as much as you can. If you can, because by the way, usually at that point you may, especially after a fight, you may be exhausted as well, so that's becoming also pretty complicated. So you understand really how telling the truth, how simple it is. It's not really, in order to explain it, it's fairly complex, and that's why von Clausewitz is trying to make you understand the very reason, so that in reality, when these things are applied, you don't really it's very difficult always to decide what to do. But in theory, the concept is very simple. It's actually mathematical, and even if it doesn't get fully mathematically applicable, still the nature of things is still mathematically working, right? The problem for you is calculating that maths. That is something we can't fully do. That's where where the genius of Clausewitz in theory really is about, is renouncing to the presumption that you can really understand everything. You're not omniscient. Sorry, if we remind it to you, but that's what really is. So here von Clausewitz goes on and says, the consequence of that is generally the postponement of the action. As much as possible, okay, we already read it, but that was worth reading it. The postponement of the action. This is one of the words that von Clausewitz highlights, right? Postponement of the action, right? So it's important to see it from that perspective. Is to say, it's never about being defensivistic or aggressivistic. You just have, if you're in defense with a negative purpose, you're just waiting for the next, for the best moment to arrive. You may not really know when the best is. You may actually not even have it. You might as well be at one point you're gonna be defeated, point, right? But still, there is a way to play on it, right? There is a way to wait for reality to change face, or at least to turn out more favorable, right? And in war, this happens dramatically frequently compared to other human activities, social activities. Okay, so here von Clausewitz goes on, says, "We have seen, therefore, in the foregoing reflections, that there are many ways to the aim, that is, to the attainment of the political object." So there are all events that control and modify war, so that war depends entirely on politics, on policy, and therefore there are many ways to achieve a political object, of which the military instrument is just a tool, and cannot, it's, you decide basically how to use, but it's not a mean. It's just an instrument. It's just a mean, right? It's not an end. You don't have to. There's not a. It's probably a better way to use war than to resort to war than others, but still, it depends on you, not really on war, right? But he continues that the only that the only means is the combat, and that consequently everything is subject to a supreme law, which is the decision by arms, that where this is really demanded by one, it is a redress which cannot be refused by the other. That therefore a belligerent who takes any other way must make sure that his opponent will not take this means of redress of his cause, or his cause may be lost in that supreme court. Hence, therefore, the destruction of the enemy's armed force amongst all the objects which can be pursued in war appear always as the one which overrules all the others. So this is particularly meaningful, because also there is this beautiful metaphor, the decision by arms. This is as if it was a trial by arms, right? So here basically von Clausewitz tells us that although there are definitely different means to attain your political object, once you use war, you're using it, there is no other settlement of combat but by decision by arms. There are no other sensible options to end an act of violence if you are engaged into it violently. That there is no other way you can pretend that during combat someone from the other side is saying, well, okay, so let's that he will be soft fundamentally on you, because in combat that's how the decision occurs, right? So woe basically to whoever thinks that in war you can have a different object than the destruction of the enemy's armed force. There's not one. There are many ways to reach it, even from a strictly military point of view, even without counting, even if you wanted politics to stay away from it, assuming absurdly that politics doesn't interfere in war constantly, still you have physical war, for example, that can open to you certain different options of action, and that you can take, obviously, and that are very difficultly to identifiable, at least in what that will translate into once you take them, what the clash will evolve into, because that would be still very, very complicated. It's not easy even to read a map, for example, and to figure out but even maps are approximated by definition. That's a perfect example of how you can't actually have a full understanding of, foretelling of how a conflict will, combat will end. Perfect provision of how combat will end if you don't have a real understanding of the territory. And even if you knew it, even if you had that perfect knowledge, probably you wouldn't have the intellectual capability to observe which option to take. You should be able to imagine infinite scenarios based on the infinity of the territory surface. So this is really the point. What really matters is that as an object, you stay focused on the destructions of the enemy's armored force by the foe, and then everything follows accordingly. And that's still difficult, but still having this clarity in mind that everything settled by arms is bringing to destruction one armored force it's essential for waging a war, fighting a war. And von Clausewitz says, what may be achieved by combinations of another kind in war, we shall only learn in the sequel, and naturally only by degrees. So this is obviously what he's foretelling us, then anticipating us. We content ourselves here with acknowledging in general their possibility, and something pointing to the difference between the reality in the conception and to influence of particular circumstances. So this is still conceptual. It's thinking about it. It's still not seeing it applied. But it's pretty damn important, because without it you can't get any clear understanding of how it turns out. Here von Clausewitz says, in fact, but we could not avoid showing at once that the bloody solution of the crisis, the effort for the destruction of the enemy's force, is the firstborn son of war. This is one of the most beautiful phrases perhaps in the whole Vom Kriege. This is the point. The bloody solution of the crisis is the firstborn son of war. And when you see it conceptualized like this, it's so powerful, because here von Clausewitz is not, if you say, just make an if you go out there normally to the average person, you say something like bloody solution of the crisis is the firstborn son of war. I think everybody would immediately take, just thinking in your mind, because everybody would take it as a moralistic statement. I mean, let's be honest about it. This phrase sounds like, especially if extrapolated, as if you had never heard about von Clausewitz, as something terrible, that therefore should make you even avoid even thinking to use violence, and maybe stressing the fact that you shouldn't use it, right? It sounds very political, it sounds very moralistic in some ways, very ethical, at least. And yet, what is impressive is reading this phrase after these first two chapters, and after having seen how this statement doesn't absolutely emerge from any kind of moralistic statement. It is true. And here it's not presented by the author like, in the sense, well, you shouldn't use violence at all, ever. This is being told by a guy who is basically explaining you what war is, because theoretically, whether you like it or not, you might find yourself into one. Now, this is obviously not the only you know meaning of the Vom Kriege menu. It has many that are all coexisting, but at the same time, that's something useful that you can use. So I asked you to make now this mental exercise to make you understand how deeply emotionalistic our culture has become. How a phrase like this, the bloody solution of the crisis, is the first son of war, is not something that should lead you to, whether, either to make war, not, or preferably not to make it, but simply to the realization that this is simply how it is, and that war exists, and that this is what you know, because it's a treasure. It's something you can make treasure of, because this can turn out useful, can help you to understand what war really is in the first place. Bloody solution of the crisis is the first-born son of war. Terrific phrase, and the meaning is obviously still it's incredible. Here the phrase in German is: Aber wir dürfen nicht unterlassen, schon hier die blutige Entladung der Krise, das Bestreben zur Vernichtung der feindlichen Streitkraft als den erstgeborenen Sohn des Krieges geltend zu machen. Now, this phrase is enormous to me. I think it's one of the most beautiful you can ever conceive. I rarely have heard something so powerful, so effective, and so true at the end of the day. And this is a very powerful warning against thinking that you can use war without responsibility. Here, I believe that this is the admonishment saying, look, that once you decide to use the military instrument, that's what you get first of all, radically, as the most immediate, the most visceral result, because that's what the firstborn, that's what a son is. So it comes first, it comes immediately. You have to get to go pretty far along the road to get something else. That's the first thing you get. So it's not an option, right? So and then von Clausewitz goes on and says, when political objects are unimportant, motives weak, the excitement of forces small, a cautious commander tries in all kinds of ways, without great crises and bloody solutions, to twist himself skillfully into a peace through the characteristic weakness of his enemy in the field and in the cabinet. We have no right to find fault with him if the premises on which he acts are well-founded and justified by success. So in other words, here politics comes back in and says, and Clausewitz says, basically, there are wars in which, and most wars are definitely much less bloody at all times than they could ever be. This is pretty much obvious. And why is this the case? Because there are effects fundamentally mitigating it, and this comes firstly from politics, right? So many wars are fought in this kind of soft way. Actually, it's it's obviously a perspective, but there are wars that follow basically more the political line, that are in this sense kind of that are led by weaker motives, because politically speaking, what you want to achieve with that war is something that maybe you don't really care so much about. So it's fine. Clausewitz is telling us, you can't blame that, because that commander just follows that path because, that's fundamentally what he's told to do, and there is a valid reason, and that is hopefully, the right one. Obviously, there are political decisions that are terribly wrong, and also that's why many wars go terribly wrong from expected. This is already just always exists by default, but politically speaking, there can be huge mistakes that bring to hugely bad, regrettable consequences in war. However, for Clausewitz says, still we must require him, the general, to remember that he only travels on forbidden tracks where the god of war may surprise him. That he ought always to keep his eye on the enemy, in order that he may not have to defend himself with a dress rapier if the enemy takes up a sharp sword. That is to say, yes, okay, there are wars in which things are pretty soft theoretically, but never think, this is the point, never think that this cannot escalate into something greater, for which you say, well, okay, well, it's not important. There are many wars that actually started like this. I mean, think about the Vietnam War. That had a long beginning. That was fairly, contained in terms of actual violence unleashed. Then it escalated. This often happens, and it's often how all wars happen. Actually, that it's very difficult to find an example in history of wars that actually, first of all, broke out in a place where you expected them, clearly, because remember the constellations of the political sky, which von Clausewitz talks about, all the various combinations. Well, that's already very difficult to predict in the first place. Secondly, they may actually start as relatively small conflicts, and it turns out that great part actually of how these escalate into larger conflicts is exactly, or at least maybe it's not really the cause, here I can be wrong in Clausewitzian theory, but still that suspension of action, or that searching for the tendency for the negative purpose, actually highly inflates the losses overall. That is to say, okay, let's start, just like with a relatively light shot, and then you see that many in the enemy resist, and they say, okay, well, we should go heavier, and maybe you go in the way you already did, but stronger. But still, the enemy at that point has gained a knowledge about your methods that maybe you didn't expect, and it strikes you back in a way you didn't expect. So you lick your wounds and you stay there. You leap back. You go back in defense with a negative purpose, and then the enemy gains strength, and then you have to commit other force. So it's an escalation. That's really how conflicts emerge. Conflicts are all around. How wars really emerge, break out, and they inflate, because that's in the nature of the same wars. So what here from Clausewitz very nicely, the way at least he puts it, it's very nice. It says, the problem is that if you should be prepared at all time to meet the enemy in a proportionate way. That is to say, you can't go to a fight with a dress rapier when the enemy is using a sharp sword, right? Even if the enemy maybe is not showing it to you, you don't know what the enemy can resort to. So you should at least provide yourself a sharp sword. Maybe just begin with a dress rapier, but just having the bigger gun, bigger weapon in this case, bigger blade to respond to it, which is something also dramatically important now in terms of doctrine, I would say. It's not just about the troops that the actual armored forces that you have, but also here von Clausewitz is speaking about the right measure and the right solution, right, in the first place. So you never can you should never being caught by the enemy, by unprepared, let's put it this way. And this requires naturally an investment, and it should be the investment that would lead you also into this, because if you have a military instrument and you don't use it, or at least you maybe you prepare and invest much into it, but you actually don't seize the opportunities that you can with it, well, you have concretely lost, in part, even politically, even socially speaking, because those are costs that are left unemployed. So that's where also much greater debates about the use of violence are put into discussion. But at the same time, it should be the same preparation, the same military preparation. It should bring to the idea that you form armed forces should be able to tell you, at least as a political leader, whether it's the right moment to use the force or not. Obviously, it's still politics that controls it, but still, it's the same disposal of armed forces should suggest you basically, look, I have this, may I use it effectively? It's not an easy decision, but that's one decision for which who makes more use of armed forces usually also knows how to use it better. And this is a problem socially, historically, politically, because there are many countries that have armed forces but do not have actually a very good doctrine. Not all countries in the world are like Belgium or Canada that have the best doctrines out there for their own armed forces. There are countries that have very sound armed forces, but fundamentally they don't know what to do with them, because they do not have a political, civic, or historical or military culture, and they're fundamentally backwards, and there are enemies out there that they're just there to exploit. Because if these guys go at war, let's assume, and they don't know how to use their military instrument, then they're gonna get eaten alive. And this, by certain measure, always happens, because you're never at in the best shape you could be, right? There is always something better you can do it, but obviously there are also some limits that are pretty foggy to identify, but they still exist that you should push towards to. And that's why the abstract conception of war comes back, because that's exactly what von Clausewitz has told us. It's not that we shouldn't opt for the most effective, the strongest and most direct commitment, militarily speaking, when we have to choose to use to solve to settle the matter with violence. But there are impediments that are sometimes that are always laying within the same political, social, and military essence, I would say, that in our mind at the end of the day. So it's terribly complicated, actually, and that's where all the difficulties in waging war stem from. But choosing one side for which you're either a pacifist or a militarist, do not really bring to anywhere, because you're basically saying that everything lays just for one side, and you don't understand that you should consider case by case. And naturally, this is all very challenging, because in part we tend to think through dichotomies. It doesn't matter how complex our the intersection of this dichotomies is, but still we tend to swing between two extremes, and it's very difficult for us to get a kind of a balanced, more precise attitude, simply because it's simpler, apparently. Then things go wrong because you go to the extreme without thinking, and then disasters ensue, and then that should teach you with true reason and wisdom that you should do something should invest more in figuring out what you have to do first, right? Then, by concluding this second chapter, let's read the last phrase. The consequences of the nature of war, how ends and means act in it, how in the modifications of reality it deviates, sometimes more, sometimes less, from its strict original conception, fluctuating backwards and forwards, yet always remaining under that strict conception as under a supreme law. All this we must retain before us and bear constantly in mind in the consideration of each of the succeeding subjects, if we would rightly comprehend their true relations and proper importance, and not become involved incessantly in the most glaring contradictions with reality, and at last we're our own selves, which is basically what I just said before reading the phrase, right? And that's really, but I will obviously leave von Clausewitz ending with this, because naturally he tells things much better than I do. And so, yeah, I'm very glad that we finished the second chapter at this point. I'm very happy, and we will pass next time, chapter 3, the genius for war, genius, the military, the warrior genius, der kriegerische Genius. And okay, so well, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.